Hey folks, back again here to talk about a video that came across my feed again from a channel called Religiosity Plus. I just quickly looked at it. I don't know if the host is someone with a background in the area or is just someone who has an interest in the subject matter, like me. I'll say what I found from this host from this channel is that he's very good. I almost say sort of his presentation is enviable in how he presents information. And when I looked at the description of the channel, he also states clearly that all faiths and backgrounds are welcome. I personally appreciate that. You know, I am a Christian apologist. I mean, I guess that's the category I fall into. But for the most part, my goal is really for there to be tolerance and understanding, mutual understanding. I'm not someone who's going to sit here and criticize other faiths or other backgrounds. I'll criticize arguments. I'll criticize arguments all day, but I don't believe in criticizing people, including the person who put this video together. So I'm going to start into this video because what I think this video is good for is laying out what the sort of generally held view amongst non-scholars, the interested lay group, as it were, the group I consider myself to be in, the group of people who cares about the subject matter, but is not someone who has the scholarly subject matter background, dedicating their lives to this. I want to use this video to point out that view. This channel has 22,000 subs, and as I said, the host is very good, very clear in his ability to present material, and is going to talk about Q and give a really fantastic presentation on Q. There are a number of problems with the presentation here, and I'm going to talk about them. But this is a reflection of what the general sort of, I'd say, prosumer religious studies person has come to believe. So let's start the video and we'll discuss from there.
The vast majority of Bible scholars today believe that there was an ancient document filled with the sayings of Jesus Christ that is now unfortunately lost to the sands of time. This document would have originally been written in Greek and would have floated around within the first couple of decades after the death of Jesus, and would have predated the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This ancient document is called Q, sometimes called the Q source or even the Q gospel.
All right, so we've talked about this in a lot of different places on this channel, but we'll just quickly summarize. So we'll start with the first point, which is the vast majority of scholars take this position. We've established that. That's true. No problem with that. The argument for what Q is or hypothetically could be is accurate. That is what the scholars who postulated Q believe, that it's this early document of sayings potentially of Jesus that necessarily predated the Gospels of at least Matthew and Luke. So we'll go on here.
The interesting thing about Q is that most Bible scholars believe that Matthew and Luke used Q to help them write their Gospels. But there is a problem with Q, and that is that there is no physical manuscript evidence that it ever existed. Q is a hypothetical document.
So just pausing here, a couple things here. One is that, again, this is the mainstream scholarly position, and the position, it's important to understand where that comes from, because there are two things that are required in order for us to get to this Q hypothetical. The first is that Mark was the first of the synoptic gospels written. If you don't hold that position, there is no need for Q. It can't really be postulated, at least not in the way that it's described. So one is you have to believe in Markan priority. And then the second is that you have to believe that Luke and Matthew could not have known of one or the other's gospel. Those are the two assumptions that you have to believe at the outset. And so for us here, especially on this channel where I focused on all of the problems with Markan priority, it's important to get out up front that the reason we're even having a conversation about Q, the reason we're even needing to create a hypothetical document is because of Markan priority. Without that, with the traditional view of Matthew being first, and again, I'm going to do a different video on this. I'm going to argue this point with evidence for why Matthew is and should be first. I've done other videos on this, but the reason why here on this channel we need to spend time on discussing Q at all is because scholars have put the Gospel of Mark first. That is the only reason. If the traditional notion that Matthew was first was accepted, there would be no need for a Q. Now, what I do want to say is that while it's presented, and again, I think this host does a really fair job, so I'm not criticizing the host. That's, again, I say this over and over again. I don't have anything personal against people. I don't even know this person. I didn't see his name. I actually admire and respect him from everything that I've seen. And I think all he's doing, in fairness to him, is relaying the information that's been presented to him. And that's fair. And that's actually why I want to do this video, because he's just relaying the information that's been presented to him. And as someone who I'm going to assume doesn't do this particular topic all the time, it's totally understandable why he has just taken the views that he's taken as given and kind of moved on from it. But the point with Q is that if Mark was first, and if Matthew and Luke did not know one another, if those two assumptions are true, then given the large amount of material that's copied back and forth between Matthew and Luke, I should say that there's a presumption of copying here. Again, that's a different point for a different time. But the presumed literary dependence between the content found in Matthew and Luke, the double tradition, given that seems to be very closely literarily related, there would have to be another source that was shared between Matthew and Luke if those first two assumptions are true. That it has to be true. So while Q may not exist now, I want to be very clear that it's not problematic to postulate that Q could have once existed if those first two assumptions are true. Now, as we've said, those first two assumptions don't need to be true. That we're not required to hold those assumptions, but if you do hold them, then Q is necessary. All right, so enough on that. I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit to hit the framing of this host here on the synoptic problem. Again, as with all of these, I'll link the entire video in the description. You should watch it. It's pretty good in general. Okay, here we go.
So Mark is a source for Matthew and Luke. As a matter of fact, so much of Mark is found within Matthew and Luke that if you've never read Mark, but you've only read Matthew and Luke, you have read all of Mark's gospel with the exception of just 18 verses. That means Mark only has about 3% of unique material found in his gospel that isn't found in Matthew and Luke.
Okay, fact check. This is true. No problem with it. Just want to make sure that no one's thinking that I have any issue with this. This is an accurate recitation of the factual record. So, go on here.
Mark's gospel is the shortest with only 16 chapters. But Matthew and Luke's Gospels are much longer. So here's where the conundrum comes in. If Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, where did they get their other information? If they didn't get it from Mark, where did it come from? Well,
so let me pause here because this, again, is the right question. If Mark is first and Matthew and Luke share information that's not found in Mark, the right question is, where do they get it from? Now, to repeat the arguments that we've made and the observations that we've made, both on that we'll do in this video and in other videos, we don't need to ask that question if Matthew was first. We don't need to ask it at all. That entire problem evaporates. There are portions between Matthew and Luke that don't line up one to one, and there's some nuance to the argument. But if Matthew's first, this issue's gone. Poof. So let's keep going here.
Well, there must have been another source. And in scholarship, this is called the Synoptic Problem. And the Synoptic Problem isn't as much a problem as it is a puzzle. Over time, scholars have come up with a number of solutions to the Synoptic Problem, but none have gained as much steam as Q. But why is this? Why is Q viewed by most scholars to be the best explanation for where Matthew and Luke got their extra information? Why couldn't Matthew have just copied Luke? And why couldn't Luke have just copied Matthew? Or why couldn't they all have gotten their information from various other sources? And how do we know Mark's gospel came first? Why couldn't Matthew have come first and then Mark copied from Matthew? Or what about Luke copying from Matthew and Mark? Why Q? Or even more mischievously, how do we know that Matthew and Luke didn't just make up the other stories not found in Mark?
So, do you guys see all the issues here? We've touched on this. Look at all the questions and the extra assumptions we're going to have to get to now because of putting Mark first. Again, if there's a reason, if we're obligated or compelled to put Mark first, then we should. That's the intellectually honest thing to do. But look at all of the questions and problems that arise out of arguing that Mark must be first. We have to now explain this other information found in Matthew and Luke. We have to explain which one of those, where do they get it from? What additional source that we no longer have has it? And some of the other issues here. Again, we won't rehash all the problems, but this is a problem with putting Mark first. Again, if we have to do it, we have to do it. But as we'll continue to discuss in this channel, we don't have to, and we'll get to that.
Let's talk about why that is. If you want to uncover the evidence for Q's existence, the first question you must answer is which gospel was written first, and how can you prove it? As I stated earlier, Mark is almost unanimously viewed as the first gospel ever written.
All right, so let's get to that. This framing is accurate. If you're going to ask questions about Q, you have to have a viewpoint on which gospel is written first. Now, remember, we only have to even ask questions about Q because we're postulating that Mark is first. So let's go on here.
But why? Well, first off, it's the shortest with only 16 chapters. Stories are usually added to over time, not subtracted from.
Okay, so I'm really going to try not to poke at this host for this point. I think he's just relaying what he's learned, what he's been taught. But the first point, so asked, okay, why Mark? How do we know Mark is first? And the first argument he gives, again, this is slightly different from the argument, at least that the mainstream scholars who focus on the synoptic problem give. Now, many scholars do make these arguments, including scholars who looked at the synoptic problem, 100 or so years ago when Mark was originally, 100 to 200 years ago when Mark was originally put forth to displace Matthew. So this is not a criticism of this host, but the point here is that one of the pieces of evidence is that Mark is a shorter gospel. And for many people, this is a challenge for them in accepting the fact that Mark could be later. And I just want to touch on a quote. I've used it in other work that I've done from the eminent late biblical scholar E.P. Sanders, who talks about this approach to literary criticism and source criticism. And he challenges assumptions like these. And for those who are familiar with the field, you know E.P. Sanders. And if you don't, he's widely respected amongst biblical scholars for a number of things. And I think, even if he wasn't, this point that he's making, I think, is otherwise sort of able to be verified as true. So it's not just because he said it. It does add weight given his background. But it's also as you'll see, a point that should be the default here, and that is, he says, quote, increasing length, 1, 2, increasing detail, 3, diminishing Semitisms, and 4, what amounts to 2 criteria, use of more direct discourse and the conflation of episodes, end quote, does not by itself have probative value in terms of determining which of any 2 sets of texts came before the other. And he also says, quote, that one cannot establish tendencies by citing only examples. What is needed is a thorough investigation of all the evidence, considering how many instances there are which point in each direction. Listing only some instances, all of which point in one direction, is neat, but useless and even misleading, end quote. The reason I bring these 2 statements up is because if one of the arguments is going to be that we expect Mark, or we expect the latter gospel to increase in length and increase in detail, that there's good reason, again, from eminent scholars in the field, why that should not be on its own an argument used one way or the other. So this is not just my opinion, that my personal opinion, that Mark being shorter doesn't argue one way or the other. This is the opinion of an eminent scholar in the field, and many others. Again, he's representative of many other scholars. So let's move on here.
Just the length of Mark's gospel can be a little bit of evidence to suggest that it was written first. Because as the story of Christianity grew, it got more and more popular. And so people wanted more and more information about this popular person of Jesus Christ.
So I don't want to criticize this argument too much, that as the story of Christianity grew, people wanted more and more information. There is an entirely, purely apologetic way of viewing this, which is that the Gospels are written as the truth from God to the papyrus. Others can make that argument. It's not the type of argument that I make here. It's not because I don't believe it. It's just that I don't find arguments like that to be persuasive to people who are currently unpersuaded, and it's untestable, and so it's not falsifiable, as it were. And so, sometimes we're stuck with arguments like that, and we have to deal with them. But if we can avoid them, then we should. But there's another issue here that I want to that separating out the issue of whether the Gospels, whether there was this hunger or demand for more information and more knowledge about Jesus, and sort of the implication that a legend grew over time with respect to Jesus. I'll go ahead and accept that here. As I said, that I don't personally believe that, or I think there are some issues with that, but I'll just go ahead and accept that as true here, because it doesn't change the point that I want to make here. But accepting that there's this increasing hunger and growth of increasing hunger as the church is growing for knowledge about Jesus, there's another potential issue here that's also potentially happening, which is that the church is moving further and further away from its historically Jewish origins, from its Galilean-based center of gravity, to moving out into other regions. And while this church was growing, it was reaching out to people who did not have Jewish backgrounds, did not have the Semitic backgrounds that sort of underlie the original Jesus narratives. Those people also, as we're going to concede here, had interest in knowledge and knowing about this story. But they may not have cared. It may not have even understood prophecies, Isaiah and Daniel and everything else. They may not have understood it. It may have meant nothing to them. Likely didn't. And in addition to that, this group of people may not have had the same capacity and appetite to listen to, again, most of these stories at the time were read out loud, to listen to the entire Gospels being read out loud to them. And so it's easy to postulate the notion of a shorter gospel coming later with Mark. And again, it's not the argument here that this is what happened, but when we're putting out hypotheses, we also need to be able to put out other completely, in this case, secular Platonic hypotheses that don't rely on the Gospels being infallible, text written by God. We need to be able to put out these other hypotheses, and one is that Mark could have been writing in a different area at a different period of time, where the audience Mark was trying to reach didn't care about, wouldn't have understood, would have had no relevance to Old Testament passages referencing deep dives into Jewish law and Jewish customs, into Old Testament prophecy. It may have also been writing a gospel where the intention was for it to be read out loud. Mark is the shortest gospel. It can be read out loud in a fairly short amount of time. I've heard numbers about this, but probably the amount of time of watching a good feature-length movie, maybe a longer movie like The Godfather or something like that. But Mark could have been read out loud to an audience, and the author of Mark could have had, while certainly writing within the genre of biblical gospels, whatever that genre is, Mark could have had the intention of putting something out that could be read out loud to a group of people who were unfamiliar with the original Old Testament references and Jewish customs and everything else, and had the appetite of learning about this story, but wanted essentially the quick and dirty. So that's just a hypothesis. I put that out there to say that we don't have to assume that because a later gospel was shorter, that in any way means it had to be later. And again, to be fair to the host here, it's just relaying, and doesn't put a lot of weight on this, but it's just relaying what he's come to learn. So we'll move on here. Hey folks, apologies here. I think the original video, I'm not going to go back and re-record it, but it was a little bit cropped, and so I recentered it, and we'll just continue here now.
Mark. But also, Mark's gospel has what scholars call the lowest Christology, meaning that Jesus' humanness is emphasized more than his divineness. As time went on, leading all the way up to the 4th century, Jesus' divine nature was emphasized more and more. So much so that some believed that Jesus wasn't really a human at all, but only seemed to be a human. This is called a high Christology. So if this pattern is true, that Jesus' Christology got higher and higher over time, then we just work our way backwards and look at the gospel with the lowest Christology. And in this case, it happens to be Mark. But
okay, I don't want to argue this point too much here. There are plenty of people who do work on the Christology of the Gospels and argue that Mark actually has a very high Christology, and I think that there are really good arguments for that. And maybe I'll do a deep dive on that later. But we'll just go ahead and accept it for now, because I don't think it's a persuasive argument, even if we accept it as being true. And you'll see why here in a second.
But there is an argument used against using Christology as a form of dating Gospels, because Paul wrote before the time of the Gospels, and Paul had a very high Christology. So some scholars believe that this throws a wrench in using Christology as a method to date the Gospels.
So kind of self-answering here, the Christology argument has problems, and again, I'm not gonna get into which was earlier, Paul or the Gospels. I think a lot of people hold that it's Paul. There are arguments to be made on dating. The dating issue is fraught. It's error prone. It's assumption laden. It's been botched really badly by the Academy, and so we should be skeptical anytime we hear anything about dates. But the issue here is that this notion that there was a low Christology at the time of Mark is doubtful for a number of reasons. There are scholars out there who say the highest Christology was the earliest Christology, and I may have that quote not exactly right, but anyway, that's the point there. So we'll move on here. So moving on here.
Dating Gospels is serious science, and it goes far beyond what I am able to mention in this video. But rest assured that there is a ton of scientific, historical, archaeological, papyrological evidence that scholars look at to make these determinations. And most scholars agree Mark was written first.
Okay, wow. I mean, if that was true, that would be persuasive. It would be compelling. I've said before, I once thought that was true. And I understand why the host of this channel would think that. Because that's what you should think when scholars reach consensus, when a group of academics reaches a consensus, the way they have with respect to Markan priority, with respect to a lesser degree, to gospel dating, and some of these other issues. You should expect, if you're not in the field, that has been subjected to rigorous scrutiny, archaeological evidence, rigorous scientific evidence, tough examination, challenges, and that what we're getting is the fruit of that work. That's just not happened here. It's not happened. We've talked about it. There is really no doubt that that's not what is going on here. It's a lot of negatives. That's not what's going on here. And there's really no doubt about that. We don't have a single bit of archaeological evidence that puts dates on when the Gospels are written. We don't have it. If someone says you have it, hey, I got it, it's in this paper, it shows it, yep, send it over. But I've not seen it. I've looked for it. I've not seen scholars who make dating argument. We went through Professor Goodacre's dating argument in an earlier video. I've not seen the scholars who actually do this point to that and say, hey, the reason why we hold this position is because of this fragment or this bit of papyrus that we found. Not seen it. Not seen the carbon dating evidence that puts a priority issue together, that put the dating issue together. It's not been seen. Any of the other sort of rigid type of analysis that you would expect, contradictions, conflicts, statements from the historical record that say, oh, no, it was Mark. That was first. We don't have any. We don't have a single historical record that puts Mark first when discussing priority or at all. There's a very, very weak argument for Papias, and so I just want to flag that. I'm going to do a thing on Papias here in the next couple of videos. But it's wrong. So, we don't have anything that says from the time of antiquity that says Mark was the first gospel written. We have several things that put Matthew first. And so I understand why somebody would if you don't look at this data and you haven't looked at it for yourself, which I was in the position of, you would think, oh yeah, this is well settled. Scholars have done this. The work has been done. The science is clear. The historical records are clear. We just don't have that. We absolutely do not have that. In fact, what we have is the opposite. We have a strong historical record, and all of the evidence that's found points toward Matthew being first, and is, we'll just say at this point, equivocal on dating. So let me just cue up the next segment of this video. But actually, really quickly, before I go on, what I did want to emphasize from this is the surety that this host is using, the confidence. And we were told to rest assured this work has been done. Again, I'll keep saying it, because I don't know when, I'd say these things. I don't know if you're going to start the video in the middle, or listen to the whole thing. So I want to be really clear, not criticizing him at all, because this is where I was, and this is where I think most people are, and have a right to be, because we can't study and be experts in every field. We have to trust experts in fields that aren't ours to do this work. So when he says, rest assured that this work has been done, I totally get where he's coming from. It has not been done. And that assurance is, I think, where a lot of lay people, the kind of prosumer level or even lay person, has come to accept a lot of what's been put out. And I would include some scholars in this group. There's some scholars that don't focus on the synoptic problem, don't focus on dating. They learned Mark was first way back when in school and have never had any reason to challenge it. And so even though they may be included in the consensus, as it were, they have not done any kind of modern dive on it. And so why I say I don't think this is even an issue of foolishness or ignorance or anything else. I just think for the past 150 years, 200 years, Mark's been taught as being the first gospel written. It's based on a shaky foundation that's been since debunked. It's never really been replaced. A lot of scholarship hinges on it being first, and so a lot of scholarship would be upended if it was changed. And so when I say that there are agendas, again, I don't know what they are, but one agenda that I speculate there to be is that it would require the undoing of a lot of work, and scholars don't have a vested interest in doing that. Pure speculation is baseless. When I say it's baseless, I don't have any independent basis to believe that, but or to prove that, but that's just a hunch of mine. So I want to be clear. But in any event, we were told to rest assured that this work has been done, and it has not. All right, so I've killed that enough here. All right.
There is one last piece of evidence I want to look at that shows with a high degree of certainty that Mark was written first.
Oh boy, a high degree of certainty. Cannot wait to hear what this is.
But it also shows with a high degree of certainty that Matthew and Luke used Mark when writing their Gospels and not the other way around. The evidence has to do with the sequence of events that occur in chronological order in the Gospel accounts. Because if you've ever read the Synoptic Gospels, you can see that a lot of the stories are the same, but they're not exactly the same. And if they copied each other, you would expect them to be more alike than they are. The truth of the matter is this. When Luke and Matthew include a story or saying that is also found in Mark, they always have the exact same sequence.
Oh boy. All right. Again, I'm not. This is not the host's fault, but this argument is just so bad. And if it was just someone like this host who was making it, we could let it go. But I've showed you guys in other videos, I've discussed this, in many other places. This argument, which is a part of the argument from order, is just so bad. And it is frustrating to me that this argument has been allowed to be put out, that the Academy is not ashamed of this argument. And so what the host is saying here is that there is a shared sequence between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the argument is, look at the order in Mark. And when you look at the order in Mark of where they share stories together, Matthew and Luke have that same order. Mark must have been first. Folks, we know that is inherently fallacious. It's mind-boggling that is not seen easily and discredited immediately by the Academy. If we take Matthew and put Matthew first, and then look at Matthew's order, and then we see the order in Mark and in Luke, we'll see, wow, look, the order in Mark and Luke tracks Matthew exactly. And guess what? If we did the same thing with Luke, we did the same thing. Completely valueless, useless argument, proves nothing, yet it is an argument that many, not just prosumers like the host here, again, and he might not be, I don't, maybe he's an expert in the field, I don't know, but many who are experts in the field, certainly use this terrible argument. Okay, let's go on here.
Meaning they show up in the same part, in the same context within the broader gospel narrative. But when Luke and Matthew have similar stories that are not found in Mark, the sequence is almost always different. For example, consider the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitude.
So let me, before we get into this, let me just take a second here to rephrase the argument here. So what we're being told is, when all three of the Synoptic Gospels share stories, the order of those stories tends to follow the same order that you see in Mark. Okay? As we know, right? We could say the same thing if we put any of the other Synoptic Gospels first. But when you're looking at just Matthew and Luke, those stories don't appear to follow the same order. A story from Matthew that only appears in Luke will appear in sort of a different place where it's inserted. Obviously, because Matthew and Luke have additional content that's not found in Mark. Again, in another video, we talk about, Mark also has some stuff that's not found in either of these Gospels. But because Matthew and Luke have additional content that's not found in Mark, the content has to go somewhere. And because there's a general order of narrative, they're, depending on how you look at the stories, it's going to look like that content that's shared between Matthew and Luke is going to appear to come, quote unquote, out of order. I'm going to let the video play for a little bit, and I'm going to come back and summarize the clear problems with this. Many of you are already seeing it, I'm sure, but let's let the video play a little bit more and then discuss it.
The Lord's Prayer does not show up in Mark at all, but it does show up in both Matthew and Luke, but in two totally different contexts. In Matthew, the Lord's Prayer shows up in the context of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus tells the audience not to heap up empty prayers like the Gentiles do, but to pray in the following way. Then Jesus quotes the Lord's Prayer. But in Luke, the Lord's Prayer is not recorded as having happened on the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is not even recorded in Luke. Luke documents something called the Sermon on the Plain. But in Luke, there is a conversation between Jesus and his disciples where one of the disciples asks him how they ought to pray. Then Jesus gives them the Lord's Prayer. So what's going on here? Did Jesus give the Lord's Prayer twice, and Matthew recorded one version and Luke recorded the other? Or...
So this summary, let's just accept this summary as true. There are some problems with it. That's not the purpose of this video. There are some who, have real questions about, whether or not these are the same events or not. It's worth saying that the argument for copying, the argument for literary dependence that we have with the synoptics or with any set of text is strongest when the texts appear to have the same word order, same text, same parentheticals, etc. Where they're just recounting what appears to be the same events, but with different words and different verbiage, the presumption of copying is really, really weak. And I'm not saying it's not there, but it is really, really weak. And we need to be able to separate that set of examples from the examples where the literary dependence is fairly persuasive. All of these are assumptions, but the better assumptions are the ones where the text and the word order really track very closely, and it's much, much less persuasive that there's a dependence on a literary source, on a shared literary source, where there's deviation between sets of facts, locations, order of text, order of stories. It's a really important point. It's beyond the scope of this video, but there's a lot of scholarly hand waving that tries to lump those two things together, and we should not do that. All right, we'll move on here.
Or did Matthew and Luke get the saying of the Lord's Prayer from somewhere else, aka a different source? And then they just tried to fit that source into their gospel narratives wherever they saw fit.
All right, so this is fair, right? So we see two different accounts. We see, Mark doesn't include the Lord's Prayer. Mark doesn't include the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to talk about the significance of that with respect to order here shortly. But both the Lord's Prayer and the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plains, as they appear in Matthew and Luke, do not track analogously. There are differences. Luke has portions that are left out. Again, there's question about whether they are exactly the same events. Luke has a very rudimentary Lord's Prayer compared to that in Matthew. And so there's some questions about where this came from. Now, here is where things get a little bit murky but it's worth taking a second on. When we talk about the synoptic problem, we're talking about the areas where there's clear literary dependence, or at least very highly persuasive evidence that there's literary dependence. That's the more accurate way to describe it, between texts. And and the question is, which of those influenced the other? In the situation where we don't have clear literary dependence or a good presumption that there's literary dependence, there's a real question about whether we should be grouping that within the synoptic problem at all. What we know is that no matter what approach we take, and every scholar concedes this, Dr. Goodacre, the late Professor Farmer, and Austin Farrer, and all the other ones, they all concede. Very highly, it would be impossible to imagine that there weren't additional sources that aren't Matthew, Mark, Luke, or even Q. Let's set that Q to the side for a moment. That could have influenced the writers of the Gospels. Luke expressly says he relied on a bunch of different sources. There was oral tradition. Every synoptic scholar agrees that oral tradition plays some role in what we find here. The authors may have had their own personal set of information from wherever it came from. Again, and I'm trying to keep this completely out of the realm of the supernatural, and even out of the realm per se of necessarily arguing that this was the Apostle Matthew or the interpreter of Peter. I'm even leaving that aside. Whoever the authors of these texts were had sources beyond the synoptics. It includes everything from oral tradition to other sources. You have to imagine at this time there would have been all kinds of different traditions that would have been circulating, variations and stories and witnesses and people who claim to be witnesses and heretics and a bunch of other things. Like this is the environment in which these documents were written. And so it is not, but those different pieces are not pieces we use to try to solve the synoptic problem. Because as I've said, the synoptic problem is a logic problem. And ultimately, what the synoptic problem is trying to figure out is, in this narrow set of things we have, where we have a literary dependence, where we presume a literary dependence, in that narrow set of situations where it looks like text and word order, including parentheticals and everything else, is essentially identical. In that narrow context, which of those came first? How do we help understand which came first? We presume there was copying. How do we understand which came first? It's not meant to, and it can't answer how were these documents written altogether. What were all of their sources? Where was all the information they got information from? It cannot do that. Again, I've probably spent too much time on this, but I just need to flag that here, because this is an issue that exists no matter which of the Gospels we put first. There's this issue of there's necessarily some additional source that each of the writers likely drew upon. All right, so I've messed that up enough, but we'll keep going here.
The Lord's Prayer is the same story, but two different contexts. And this is also true with the Beatitudes. Did Jesus preach them on the Sermon on the Mount or on the Sermon on the Plain? Or did he preach them twice? Christian apologists and scholars tend to believe that Jesus said the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes twice. Matthew recorded one version, Luke recorded the other. Yet some Christian and especially non-Christian scholars tend to believe that Jesus only preached them once, and Mark and Luke just put them in different contexts within their Gospels. If this is
All right. So let's pause here. Actually, let me just unpause this real quickly. I might have cut something off.
true, then this would be pretty good evidence that Matthew and Luke used Mark's gospel to help them write, or more accurately, to help them structure their gospel narrative. But when they get a story that's not from Mark, they don't know where in the context it fits in, so they stick it in wherever they can. This is really good evidence that Mark was written first.
All right, folks. I don't know about you. I didn't see the clear evidence there. I've looked at this argument a few times. I know what this argument is. I'm being a little cheeky here, but if it was clear to you, it totally went over my head or under my feet or whatever of what the clear evidence here is. I know what the host is arguing, and I'm familiar with this argument. And the argument here is that we see this order, shared order, when Mark, Matthew, and Luke are all talking about the same things. It seems like those stories come generally in the same order in all three Gospels. It's not exact, but it's close, and it's a fair point. But when we're looking just at the double tradition, just at Matthew and Luke, those stories don't appear in those Gospels in the same order. And so the argument is, this is really strong evidence that Mark was first, because if Matthew was first or Luke was first, then and the other was copying from that, then we'd expect to see these stories appear, the double tradition stories, to appear in the same order in those accounts. That's the best I'm going to be able to summarize it, because the argument is inherently flawed, and it's hard to deal with arguments that are not even wrong. But this argument is just, there's so many problems with it. So let's start with the alternative hypothesis that could be given for why these stories don't appear in Mark, and how that could still be consistent with Mark writing third. One important point that's worth pointing out here is that there's this understanding that Mark is the middle term. So it's another topic. I've done other videos on this, at least another video previously on the Synoptic Problem in general. But what the argument from order does show us is that there is a relationship between Matthew and Luke and Mark. There's no doubt about that. There's a relationship. So where scholars botched the issue is they presumed that relationship meant that Mark was first. It doesn't mean that. Mark could be third. Mark could be second as well, but first and third are the better explanations for Mark being this middle term. And what it means is that there are passages that are shared between Matthew and Mark, passages that are shared between Luke and Mark, and then there are passages that are shared between all three. So Mark is the middle term. I'm going to do another video on this, because this middle term concept has been botched so badly that it needs its own video to kind of elucidate what the issues are. But assuming Mark is the middle term, which is, again, that's the phrase that's used by scholars, assuming that Mark's the middle term, that Mark is always agreeing with either all three or one or the other between Luke and Matthew. Assuming that that's the case, the best explanation for that is that Mark was first, that Mark was third. The reason why there's a rejection of Mark being third here is because of these other pieces, the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plains, the Beatitudes, Lord's Prayer, that don't appear in Mark and don't appear in the same order with respect to Matthew and Luke. Again, I have to make this point. There's really good reason why they may not agree in Matthew and Luke that has nothing to do with the Synoptic Problem, because there is evidence that they are not drawing necessarily from the exact same sources. Not a cue, not anything. They're not drawing. They're drawing from independent sources that are idiosyncratic to them, that give a slightly different recitation of these things. It's critical, but it's for another video. But assuming for the sake of argument that these are drawn from some shared source, or they should be, it could also be that if Mark was third, and the hypothesis that we laid out earlier, which is that Mark was removing information to have a shorter gospel that could be read out loud to a more Gentile-focused audience, if Mark was looking at both Matthew and Luke and saw portions where both Matthew and Luke agreed in order and in text, you could see Mark saying, okay, I'll include that. And then when Matthew comes to places in Luke if Mark, writing third, came to places in Luke and or Matthew where he didn't see that agreement, one could imagine that Mark would say, okay, I'm not going to include that, or I'm going to think twice about including that. So that's one argument, right? Mark could have also said, well, I don't know. Is it Sermon on the Mount? Is it Sermon on the Plains? I can't harmonize these. There's this Lord's Prayer and this one, and this other one kind of doesn't really have that. Maybe I'm just going to leave that out. So I just want to get the things that everyone agrees on. This would be a perfectly reasonable thing for someone writing third to do, and could result in a reason why that gospel would be shorter. So again, this is just a hypothesis. This is not argument that this is what happened. But it's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis that the third writer could have looked at both of those and said, okay, there's just some disagreement here, I'm going to leave it out. The third piece being, and again, it's beyond the scope of this discussion, but I've discussed this in my video on the improbability or lack thereof of the redaction profile of Mark if he was third, which is that a lot of the stuff that is missing from Mark, from the nativity to the Lord's Prayer to the Sermon on the Mount, that material is, according to scholars who are experts in the field, again, this is not my area of expertise, so I accept this as true. Again, I've looked at the arguments, but I can't independently critique them because I don't have the expertise to do so. They've argued these are heavily Jewish-themed portions. The nativity in Matthew really traces the lineage of Jesus to David. It tries to track Old Testament text, and that just may not. Mark may have said, "Look, the people I'm writing to, they don't even know, but they're not going to have any care about that. I'm leaving that out." You have a perfectly valid reason to leave the nativity, piece out. Again, we should not presume that a later writer necessarily has to include the manger and everything else that's come to become tradition, Christian tradition, several hundred years, onward. Sermon on the Mount, Lord's Prayer have been argued by scholars, and skeptical scholars including, to be extremely highly Jewish. I think John Dominic Crossan said, from the Jesus Seminar, argued that the Lord's Prayer is entirely and definitively Jewish. I don't have the quote exactly right in front of me, but there's nothing non-Jewish about the Lord's Prayer. So you could see Mark coming along later, writing in a Gentile region, again, under this hypothesis, could look at that and said, one, it doesn't agree. There's some differences between Luke and Matthew. And then also, they're not going to even understand this. This is not going to make any sense to them, and leave it out. If that was to happen, you could easily see how, with Matthew being first and Luke copying Matthew, and then Mark copying from both Luke and Matthew how you could have the same order in the share portions, the order found in this time, the order found in Matthew. And you could understand why Mark wouldn't have these sections in his gospel. And then with respect to Luke, if Luke is drawing on different tradition or telling a narrative in a different way, and Luke says expressly that he's using multiple sources, you can easily see why Luke would look at Matthew and say, okay, I'm going to add this in, or I'm going to do it this way, or I'm going to put this here. We cannot use that as a basis to argue, it's definitive that Mark was first. And it doesn't actually necessarily flow that Mark is first even with that. We have the same problem with respect to Matthew and Luke in either order, whether Matthew was first or whether Mark was first. We still have the same issue with respect to Matthew and Luke. So I've again sort of killed that enough. Let's move on here, and I think I'm going to wrap up with the next section here to wrap up this video. So we'll wrap up here with this discussion of Q, and then we'll summarize and get out of here.
This is pretty clear evidence that Matthew and Luke got some of their information from somewhere else. But where? This other source is, of course, the hypothetical Q source. How do we know Matthew and Luke didn't just hear the same oral traditions? Well, because as I said, they are in different sequences within the two Gospels, but they say the same thing. If it was oral tradition based, the sequence of both Gospels would be the same. Also, all of the sayings that Jesus says that are only recorded in Matthew and Luke are almost verbatim. They're word for word exact, but in different sequences. And despite what you may have heard about oral traditions, this is not the way oral traditions usually worked. The sequence would be the same, but the exactness would be off a little. But this isn't what we see in Matthew and Luke. So how exactly do we know that Matthew didn't copy Luke, or Luke didn't just copy Matthew? Well, why would the sequence be different among the two Gospels? The best explanation for why the sayings of Jesus are the same, but in a different sequence, is because they did not copy each other, but both had access to a second outside source called Q. To me.
All right, we'll wrap up here. Again, if you want to see the rest of this, just watch the video, because again, this really is not meant to be particularly a critique about Q. But just want to say some things here in closing, which is that there's a conflict here, and again, I'm assuming a lot of you sort of caught it if you were paying close attention. So, on the one hand, we have portions of Matthew and Luke that appear to track with sort of high literary consistency. They look the same text, same word order, etc. We have those. We have those portions. They don't just include, by the way, sayings. And Mark Goodacre's done a lot of work on this with respect to the Farrer hypothesis, and will do a much better job of articulating this than me. And you should read his work. But they don't just include sayings. And the argument for Q is that it was a saying source and whatnot. So again, there are portions of the double tradition that track very closely in word order and text and appear to be literary dependent on one another. So for those, we don't need to deal with Q for those at all. Okay, because as I said, if Luke copied Matthew, those portions could be easily explained by that. Where Q is coming in are these areas where it doesn't appear that there is that same word order and textual agreement between Matthew and Luke. For example, Sermon on the Mount versus Sermon on the Plains, Lord's Prayer. Even the Nativity has some different facts in both of those Gospels. With the genealogies aren't exact. And so the argument there is, what do we do with those? And that's where I'm going to wrap up this video. Is what do we do with those? Well, so one is, if we only have Q if Mark is first. So if Mark's not first, then whatever we do with those is independent of Q. So let's just deal with Mark being first. Let's say, what do we do with those now? Because if we're going to say Mark has to be first, then we have this stuff that's shared, where the text and where there appears to be a literary dependence between this double tradition. For that, it's totally reasonable to say Q. Right? If Matthew and Luke didn't know each other, it's totally fair to say Q. Because if they didn't know each other and Mark was first, there must have been some other place where they got the text that would have that kind of exact agreement. But in the parts where they don't agree in text and word order, where we can't really presume a literary dependence, and we can't just presume a literary dependence because there's a recitation of the same story or the same event. That alone, hopefully it's obvious, does not argue for literary dependence. And if that's all we had in the synoptics, we wouldn't even be able to argue that the synoptics depended on one another. So take the Sermon on the Mount Plains example. What do we do with those now? Because to say it's Q, the argument is, well, Matthew couldn't have gotten that from Luke. Luke couldn't have gotten that from Matthew. What do we do? I hope it's clear that does not argue for a hypothetical document. It can't. The necessity for a hypothetical document coming out of that fact pattern does not necessitate a Q. Because we're saying there's no clear literary dependence here, and so there could be myriad other things, all of which are equally plausible. There's an independent source, like Q, for example, that just in this particular set of circumstances, they decided to deviate from. Okay, that's one possibility. There's different oral tradition. Again, I'm not talking about different oral tradition of the exact same things, but different oral tradition from different sources. There could be different written sources that either is looking at. And I think, etc. And we actually need to postulate that, because to say that also is Q is shaky, is logically ungrounded. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that because I'm not really here to discuss Q. I think any discussion of Q is a waste of time generally, because Q exists when an assumption that we aren't entitled to make, which is that Mark was first, is put forth, and then exists where there's another assumption that I'm not sure why we're making, which is that neither Matthew or Luke was aware of one of the other's gospels, etc. So Q doesn't deserve, in my view, that much more time. But I do want to point out in the broader synoptic problem context that we're still, no matter what documentary solution we come up with for the synoptic problem, we're still going to have this issue about material that does not appear to have a literary dependence, but it seems to be telling similar stories between Luke and Matthew, and we're going to have to know how to deal with that. And for that, that's not a synoptic problem issue. That is just an issue of piecing together historical tradition and oral tradition and other sources, etc. So enough of that. I've talked about that at length, and I hope that is as clear as it can be. Where I want to wrap up here, though, is just to say that this very well put together video that was very fair. I'm not criticizing the author here or the host here at all whatsoever. This video represents, this is how views like this become settled into the mainstream. Views that Mark was first come settled into the mainstream. This is how, for people who aren't looking and scrutinizing these arguments, how they just come to accept this and just believe Mark is first, and that this was subject to rigorous, scrutiny and analysis and scientific data and evidence. Again, and I was in that group, so I can definitely at least speak for myself when I say that. We have to be careful with that, and this channel is going to focus on calling these types of things out to light, because, as I've said, there are real consequences with this question. There's things that stem from this that relate beyond the field of biblical studies, and it's important for us to get these answers right. So I'll wrap up with that, and thanks for listening.